Dave Talks Comics, Episode 123, Baltimore Comic-Con 2016, Part 2. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books, cartoons, and comic book conventions. Most episodes are a mix of summary and opinion and include spoilers. Please try to keep that in mind. Spoilers. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. In addition to the program's website, this podcast can also be found on iTunes, Stitcher, and Facebook. On this episode, I will be talking about my second day at the 2016 Baltimore Comic-Con, including what I bought, panels I went to, and what I had to eat. I am back from Baltimore Comic-Con, from the Sunday of Baltimore Comic-Con. It's actually the next day now as I'm recording this. I was a little too tired last night, and I was a little too busy last night after I got home to sit down and record right away. But I've had some time to think about the things I saw, the things I did, the whole experience of the convention, and especially the experience on the last day of the show. And I've broken it down into a number of parts. The first part was what happened before the show, up to about 10:30, which is when I got to the show. The drive to the show was much better on Sunday than it was on, well, that's really understating it. It was what I had hoped it would be on Saturday, was what I experienced on Sunday, where when I got to Baltimore, it was only a very brief drive to get to the parking garage, which was the exact same garage that I parked in on Saturday. And I wanted to say something a little bit. It was kind of an interesting garage because it was in a fairly narrow building, and it was basically, it was just a ramp that went up and up and up, and I have no idea how many floors were in that building. The first day, or on Saturday, I parked on the 5th level, and on Sunday, I got there earlier and I was able to park on the 4th level. I think there are people who park there on a monthly basis, because there were reserved spots, but I paid through Parking Panda, which worked out quite well. It was definitely less expensive through Parking Panda than it would have been if I just driven up there. I think it was something like closer to $20 if I just drove up there and went to park, and I think I paid $9 for each day. But it was kind of an interesting design because there really was, the ramp just went up, and then there would be parking spaces on each level as the ramp went up, but the ramp would just keep going up and up. There wasn't any big parking area on each level, just a few spaces. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And it doesn't look like a new building. I'm not sure how long it makes me wonder if at one point it was a factory or something else, or how long it's been a parking garage. But I just wanted to speculate on that. So I had no trouble parking, and then I went to the farmer's market because I did not have breakfast before I left my place. And that's what I've done for the last few years. In fact, almost every year that I've gone to the Baltimore Comic-Con, I think, possible exception of the first year, I have gone to the farmer's market and had breakfast there. I don't think I did quite as good a job in picking out what to have this year as I have in the past. It wasn't bad. It just, I think I've had better food, and food that I liked more in the past. Let's put it that way. I got a sausage sandwich from, and I can't remember the name of these, and I did not write down the name of these places, but there's a place that sells, like, they have like, it's not, I don't know if it would be considered barbecue, but they have grilled meat, I guess would be the way to put it. And they don't have a huge selection, but you can get a sandwich down there. I think you can also get uncooked meat from them. Not certain on that, but so I just got a sandwich. I didn't get anything else, and that didn't completely fill me up. So then I stopped at another place. I got this thing, I think it was like an Asian themed place, and something called shrimp toast, which really didn't taste like much of anything other than toast with something on it, and it didn't really taste like shrimp, or at least what I think of is what shrimp tastes like. But I only paid a couple bucks for it, and I was trying new things. And then I went to this Thai stand where I got, that's THAI, Thai stand, where I got a mango and sticky rice, which I like to get every year, and I actually took that back with me to the car and ate that in the car before I headed over to the convention center. And I also bought a couple pastries, although I only nibbled at them a little bit. They're really big. A sticky bun and what do they call it? A tea cake. So I just ate a little bit of each of those, not even, a quarter or that much, just a little taste of them, and then left them in the car and walked over to the convention center a little after 10, around 10:15 or so. Probably took me about 15 minutes, something like that, 10 minutes to get to the convention center. I thought that the show opened at 11 on Sunday. Maybe in prior years it has, or maybe I'm thinking about Heroes Con. I'm not sure. But it opened at 10, and so I got there at 10:30 and was able to go right in. From about 10:30 until noon, my focus was on shopping. And I walked through Artist Alley a little bit. I didn't stop really anywhere. I didn't buy anything. I've just got so many books. I really didn't want to buy anymore. But then, of course, I went to some of these. I went searching through the dealers' tables and found some tables where they had comics for $1 or less, for the most part. And I did end up buying more comics there. I had bought 33 comics on Saturday. I bought another 17 comics today. So 33 and 17. So I bought 50 comics altogether for the weekend. The first place I stopped didn't have a huge number of boxes, but they were 3 for $1. So I went through a lot of their boxes, not everything. And I only found 3 things, all from the same series, and those were 3 of the 4 issues that I'm missing from the official Teen Titans Index, issues 1, 4, and 5. So now I'm only missing issue 3. So I got those for $1 to add to my pile of comics, of reference comics, and I think I'm going to create a section in one of my comic book boxes that's going to be for what I call reference comics, things like Who's Who, the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, these kinds of things. I'm not sure, and there's a few other things which aren't really comic books in the sense of sequential stories, but more of reference material to help me when I'm doing research on comic books. I moved on from that table to another table where they had a sign saying they had a big collection of a lot of stuff from the 80s to the 80s and 90s stuff, I think they said, for the most part. And this collection was fairly well organized. It wasn't perfect, so things weren't completely in order, but at least you would find things for the most part grouped together. And I went through a lot of their boxes, probably 10 or 15 boxes before I finally found something that I was looking for. And one of the other nice things about this box, or this dealer, was that their boxes, just about everything was bagged and boarded, which makes it a lot easier to flip through, if nothing else. Although some of the boxes were so packed with comic books that it was hard to get a look and see what was on, which comics were in there. But the first thing I found was the Who's Who in the Legion of Superheroes, another reference type book. They had 6 of the first 6 out of 7 issues. A little disappointed that they didn't have all 7, but I wasn't going to pass on them just because they didn't have all 7 issues. So I picked those up. I also found at this dealer, it looked like a complete run of Alpha Flight. So I picked up all of the issues that I was missing from John Byrne's run on Alpha Flight, issues 17, 24, 26, 27, and 28. So I now have a complete run of John Byrne's run on Alpha Flight. And now that I have 17, I can pick up where I left off and continue reading the series because I'd read up through 16 up to this point. I found another issue from that Flash run that I'm interested in from 145 to 161 or something like that. I found Flash number 148. Fortunately, that was the only issue from that little section that I found. And I also found Young Heroes in Love #2. I picked up a number of years ago, probably over 10 years ago. I'd heard about this series probably on a blog, maybe Comics Should Be Good. I'd heard about this series, and I picked up on eBay, I bought a set of Young Heroes in Love, but it was missing a few issues, one of which was issue 2. There was a couple other issues that I found at Baltimore Comic-Con last year, and at this point I'm only missing one issue, and that's the last issue in the series, which is the 1 million issue. I tried reading the series before. I think the fact that I was missing the second issue kind of hindered me a bit, and this was probably over 10 years ago. But it looks like a kind of soap opera-ish comedy, superhero type story. It's from DC Comics, so hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, I will pick this up and start reading it. But I am, of course, still looking for that 1 million issue. I may end up buying it online instead of waiting to find it at a convention. But I was really happy when I found this, and I had my stack of comic books as I was looking through the box sitting next to me, and at one point a guy came along and picked up that issue 2 of Young Heroes in Love, which was sitting on top of the stack, and was looking at it. Or I don't know if he picked it up, but he kind of took a closer look at it. I think he put his hand on it, and at that point I picked up the stack and I moved him closer to me, and he was like, "Oh, is that yours?" And I was like, "Yes." Now it was probably a little more. It probably came out a little stronger than I meant it to. But I was so glad that I had found this issue that I wanted to make sure that nobody took it from me. So I guess I got a little possessive there. And it was almost noon at that point, and I wanted to go upstairs to the panel rooms, but I still had about 10 minutes left, so I wandered around a little more, and I found a table, something which I hadn't found up to this point, which is somebody who had like Bronze or Silver Age comics for $2 or $3 a piece. And so I looked through their boxes for as long as I felt like I had time to, and I only found one thing that interested me, and that was Blitzkrieg #3. Blitzkrieg was a war comic from the 70s, I believe created by Kanigher and Kubert. That's Robert Kanigher and Joe Kubert. And I don't think that Joe drew it, although I believe he did do the covers for it. But it's a war comic, it's a World War II comic that's told from the perspective of the Germans. It only ran for about 5 issues. I think it was probably a victim of the DC implosion. I'm not certain on that. But my guess is that it was a victim of that it was something, although it may have ended before the DC implosion, because I think that happened in 78, and I believe this comic started in 76 and only lasted 5 issues. So it may not have made it to the DC implosion. I have never seen an issue of Blitzkrieg. It's been hard to find them. And I may have seen an issue or two for sale before, but it was more than $2, so I decided I should buy this one because it's there, I'm interested in it. So I picked it up, and I paid for it, and then I went up to the panel rooms for the first of 3 panels, 3 back-to-back-to-back panels that I decided I wanted to go to. The first panel that I went to was the spotlight on Howard Chaykin. Now, I've heard Howard Chaykin a number of times. He's been on Word Balloon at least twice, including one episode, I think in the past few months. I think past 3 or 4 months he was on Word Balloon. And he was also on an episode of Sidebar, although Sidebar's gone. I think I downloaded that episode of Sidebar, so I think I have it. But and he may have been on some other podcasts, but he's an interesting character. He's a very... he's a fascinating guy, and it was a very interesting panel. He's not your average comic book creator, and it was just him. I mean, the panel was called Spotlight on Howard Chaykin, but it was just him talking to the audience, answering a few questions from the audience. He didn't really bring anything prepared to speak on, so he started to talk a little bit, and he talked about how he loves the form, but he's not crazy about the content. And so, for the most part, this hour was really not about the stuff he's worked on as much as it is about the comic book industry. One of the first questions that he got was on the prominence of writers, and he talked about how, I don't know if he talks so much about how it came to be, but about what's wrong with it, and how this is a visual medium, and there's something intrinsically wrong, and these are my words, not his. I'm paraphrasing at best. That there's something intrinsically wrong with the fact that the writers carry so much weight these days in the comic book industry. He talked about other things other than comic books. He worked in television for, I believe, at least 10 years, so he talked a bit about some of the projects he'd worked on and some of the people he'd worked with. Not all of these were names that I was familiar with. Some of the shows I had heard of, like Earth Final Conflict and Viper. I don't think I'd ever watched either one or watched more than a couple minutes of either program. But he talked about them. He talked about some of the stories about, how things went, how he was able to make money in them, at the same time how it was some of the worst work that he'd, well, I don't know, worst, it was some of the worst professionally, some of the worst stuff that he had done, at least not necessarily in terms of the output, but in terms of the environment, the working environment, how bad it was, how you would have people rewriting things who weren't writers and had no idea about how to write. And of course, as I've said, he's a man with very strong opinions, pretty sharply defined opinions, and he has no problem with opening his mouth and telling people how he feels about something. Eventually, the conversation did turn back to comic books, and one of the more interesting things that he spoke about, and I agree with him on this, is he talked about how heroes and villains, and about how villains, in their own mind, they're not completely evil. They're not evil. They think that they're the hero. And this is something which I think has come up in a few places, and usually when I don't like, quite often, not always, but quite often when I don't like a story, it's because the villain is played too much as an archetype, and doesn't seem real. They seem too one-dimensional, too bent on something that does not seem human at all. As opposed to, you take a villain, somebody like Mr. Freeze in the Batman, the animated series, and even in Batman Beyond as well, as somebody who had a mission, who had ideas about what he wanted to do, and was had a life and was trying to. He was the hero. I mean, he was not somebody who was villainous who was evil for evil's sake. And one of the ideas, which I may have mentioned before on this podcast, I'm not sure, but there was an idea from Superman on the Couch by Danny Fingeroth, who talked about how the villains, and I know I'm getting way off topic here, but the villains are the ones who want to change things, who want to see things differently, and quite often heroes stand for the status quo. And I think that kind of all feeds into what Chaykin was talking about when he talked about heroes and villains. He definitely does not speak down to the audience. It was not a huge audience, but he definitely did not speak down to us. In fact, I think some of this stuff just went over my head, and it was coming at me just a little too quickly. He's obviously thought about some of these things, or at least that's my interpretation. He's definitely thought about some of these things, and he probably he may have even written down some of these ideas that he had. But it was a great panel. I did record it. I have done some cleanup on it because there was a bit of an audio whine in the room, which I didn't really notice when I was in the room, and there's also a bit of an echo from the microphone. But I've managed to clean it up a bit, and I will be releasing that at some point down the road. But in the meantime, if you really want to hear Howard Chaykin, I would recommend checking out that episode of Word Balloon. Following the Howard Chaykin panel, immediately, 15 minutes later, in the same room, was another spotlight panel, this one on Steve Englehart. Once again, it was one creator with a microphone talking to the audience, probably about the same size audience, maybe 20 or 30 people in a room that probably could have held a couple hundred. It was, unlike the Howard Chaykin, he really didn't have anything to begin with. Howard had a couple things to begin with, but not much. But this was all questions and answers. although his answers were not, he did a good job of answering the questions. He did a good job of coming up, of having something to say. His answers were not terse or short or brief at all. They were definitely more verbose. He talked a little bit about, and all these things were things that came out of questions that came up. He talked about how he got started at Marvel. He talked about why he no longer works in comic books at this point. I think most of his output was in the 70s and 80s. I'm not certain on that. I have read some of his stuff, including recently his run on Batman in Detective Comics with Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin, which was quite good. There was a number of books that he was asked, of books and characters and stories that he was asked about, that he talked about during this hour. His run on West Coast Avengers, Silver Surfer, Detective Comics, Doctor Strange, Star-Lord, the character, who I don't think had his own, I don't know if there's ever been a book called Star-Lord except for maybe a one-shot or something like that. Avengers, the Avengers Defenders War, I believe that's what it was called. He talked a little bit about Mantis, the Avenger named Mantis, and I believe the Celestial Madonna storyline, and how Mantis changed from what he had originally envisioned her as, and then the story kind of dictated that she do something different than what he had originally had planned, and that spun her in a completely different direction. He talked a little bit more, most of his work was at Marvel, but he also talked about he was asked about the Green Lantern and the Manhunter story, where because he was the one who linked the Manhunters as the predecessors to the Green Lantern Corps. They were the ones who were originally the force that the Guardians of the Universe? I think that's right. The Guardians of the Universe from Oa used. And if you've seen the Justice League cartoon, not Justice League Unlimited, but Justice League cartoon in Darkest Night, I think it's called. In Blackest Night? Maybe it's in Blackest Night. I'm not certain. But it's the one where Jon Stewart is put on trial by the Green Lanterns for destroying a planet, and the team has to come in to help, and I don't remember exactly how it played out, but the Manhunters were involved in that, and that's a really cool, it's a two-parter, so it's an hour long, basically, which is what most of those stories were from the first 2 seasons, from the 2 seasons of the series. It was called Justice League as opposed to Justice League Unlimited, and I don't think I ever covered that episode, or I'm not sure if, I may have covered it, I'm not sure, on the podcast. I talked about a number of episodes of Justice League early on in the podcast, the first year and a half, but I'm not sure if I ever talked about that one. But it's a good one. I've never read the original story, but it was written by Steve Englehart, and so it came up in this talk. Let's see, other characters he talked about in teams. The Beast. He was writing the Beast around the time that the Beast turned furry, first gray furry and then blue furry. Captain America. Talked a little bit about which is a storyline that I want to read, because some of the things that happened when he was writing Captain America was the whole Cap becoming nomad for the first time, and I don't think he wrote the first appearances of the Falcon, but he was there, he was writing it when the Falcon gained his wings, because originally the Falcon did not have wings, could not fly. And let's see, what else? Oh yeah, JLA. He talked a little bit about his run on JLA, which I don't think lasted too long. I'm not sure if I have read any of that. He also got questions about some of the people he's worked with, some people he's known, people who he met, who also worked in comic books. The big one was Jack Kirby, and there was a big question, and he went on at some length on the question of, did Kirby really create the Marvel Universe, or does he deserve more credit for creating the Marvel Universe? And that was an interesting bit of conversation about that. He talked a little bit about working with Steve Ditko, although I think he said that he had never met Steve Ditko. Steve Ditko is a bit of a recluse and has been that way for decades now, but I believe he's still around and occasionally writes comic book stories, and worked with Steve Englehart on a story. I don't think it was a DC or Marvel thing. I think it was for an independent comic book. Talked a little bit about Marie Severin and her theory of covers. He was asked about working with Jim Shooter. He talked a little bit about Sal Buscema, Gary Friedrich, Walt Simonson, who drew the first stories before when Englehart first worked on Detective Comics. The first story, maybe 2 issues, were actually drawn by Walt Simonson. A very different look from the work with Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin. But the story kind of flows into from one. I mean, it's all part of one of his story, Steve Englehart's story for Batman. And so it's important to read those because they set things up for other things. And he talked a little bit about collecting comics and art, about his time at Malibu Comics and the attempts to integrate Malibu Comics into the Marvel Universe. And finally, talking about DC versus Marvel, about what was different in the working environments there. And honestly, the way I've talked about this right here, this is not the order that he went through these things. It was all over the place. So the first thing I mentioned was not the first thing he talked about, and the last thing I mentioned was not the last thing he talked about. I just kind of tried to group them together rather than go through everything. First he talked about this, and then he talked about this. I've done that before. It's boring. It sounds awful when I play back and listen to it. So this is how I decided to group it. But those are the kinds of things, those are the things that he talked about this. And I did record this panel, and I will be posting it. Once again, it was in the same room as the Howard Chaykin panel. So you had this audio one, but I'm doing something. I've figured out some tools I can use to kind of reduce some of that noise. So it's not going to be perfect, but it'll be better than it was, or better than the original recording is. The third panel that I went to, and I keep saying I went to, all 3 of these panels were in the same room, so I just went to this room and I stayed in the room for all 3 panels because they were one after another. And I hadn't originally planned to go to this panel, but when I saw the topic and saw that it was in the same room, I decided I should stay for this. And this was the Diversity in Comics panel. There was a panel at the Small Press Expo, I believe 2 years ago, on, I'm trying to remember the name of it. If it was, I don't think it was Diversity in Comics. It had to do with diversity in comics. And I wanted to go to it, and there was this huge long line to get in. And I just gave up on trying to get into the panel. And that's part of the reason why I went to this panel, because I hadn't been to a panel like this. I mean, honestly, all of the panels that I went to up to this point, I think just about, well, not everybody. No, there was a person of color at the first panel that I went to, the writing panel. Amy Chu was there. But there weren't that many women. I think Amy Chu, Hope Larson, and then at the editor's panel there was Louise Simonson, and then there was another woman who worked at IDW Boom. Let me see if I can flip back through my notes. It's Daphne Plebin, yes. So there were some women. There was one woman of color, but there really wasn't much. It was, for the most part, white males that I was seeing at these panels, in particular the 2 panels that immediately preceded this panel. So I figured, why not? And the subject matter interests me. So what I wasn't aware of was that the people who were the group, and it was a group, unlike the last 2 panels, we had a group of 6 people on the panel. And they've definitely got the audience involved. They have a website and a podcast called Pop Culture Uncovered. I did record this panel, but they also recorded it. So I'm going to listen to their recording, or at least I probably won't post my recording. My guess is their recording will come out better because they had a microphone right there on the table. Plus, they were probably using better recording equipment than I was, better than my iPhone 4. The panel was hosted by Belle Burr, who is a writer. Let's see, I made some notes on this. There's a number of people on this panel. I don't know. I mean, I was unfamiliar with all of them prior to this. But we had writers, actors, cosplayers, podcasters, bloggers, comic book writers, all kinds of people on this panel. But the main 2 were Belle Burr and Armand Hill, were the ones who, I guess they're the ones who run the website, but once again, I'm not all that. I'm not familiar with their website. I have taken a look at it since then. There are a lot of articles there about. It's more than just comic books, as the name Pop Culture Uncovered implies. It's so you get television and other things, anime, manga, and so on and so forth. So they started the panel by throwing a question out to the audience and asking people from the audience to respond, and that is, what is diversity? And they got a whole range of answers there that talking about both things that happen in front of the camera and behind the camera, on the comic book page, as well as the creators who are putting together the comic book page. From there, they went into asking or talking about what happens when diversity goes wrong, when you get the inclusion of minorities or of people of color, but they don't. But they're very one-note characters, and their one note seems to revolve around their skin color or the culture from which they come from, and not even the whole culture, but just one stereotyped aspect of their culture. Or you get cases where you get characters who are supposed to be of color, but they're being played by people who are not from that culture. And one of the prime examples of this was the Zorro movie, which had no Mexican, even though it takes place in Mexico, and the main character is Mexican, and the lead actor is a Spanish speaker, Antonio Banderas. It was not he's Spanish, he's not Mexican. And the other two lead actors, Anthony Hopkins and Catherine Zeta-Jones, are both from, I think they said from Wales. I was aware that Catherine Zeta-Jones was Welsh, but I wasn't aware that Anthony Hopkins was. Or maybe he's just partly Welsh. I'm not sure. And then Gods of Egypt was another one that came up. And so these were examples of when diversity goes wrong. They talked a little bit about the comic book industry's attempts, and really I think we're talking about DC and Marvel for the most part here, their attempts to diversify some of the hits and misses, the fanboy rage that occurs when they decide to do something like change not Hal Jordan, but Alan Scott, say Alan Scott's gay and he has been gay all along, or there was one point where Wally West was changed and all of a sudden he was black. Those sorts of things, and the impact it has on people who want everything to stay the same, which is where the fanboy rage comes in. There was a little bit of talk of that, and they talked about what works and what doesn't work, and I mean in attempts to make comic books more diverse, to get more characters from different backgrounds who look different into comic book stories. They talked a little bit about Nick Fury and Samuel L. Jackson, and how you first had the character in the Ultimate Universe, and then you had the character in the movies, and then they kind of took it back to comic books into the regular Marvel Universe, the 616 universe, and they just completely changed everything, and how that just was all wrong, and the people in the panel definitely didn't like that. They loved the Ultimate Nick Fury, and they loved Samuel L. Jackson in the role in the movies, but what they did, and I haven't read that stuff, I've only heard about it, but what they did it sounded very wrong, and they talk about it in the panel. There was some mention of apparently DC Comics at the con, and I never go to the panels that are sponsored, that are run by the comic book publishers, but apparently DC Comics had announced an initiative of over the next 5 years to try and get more writers of differing backgrounds in their stable, I guess you could say, in their bullpen. The bullpen's a term I associate with Marvel. And so we'll see how that goes. I mean, 5 years, if they start now, I don't know how fast we're going to see results. And they really didn't talk. I mean, there really wasn't that much to talk about. I mean, it could be basically it's a press release is what it is at this point, or at least that's my understanding. There was some talk about Rat Queens, about what worked and what didn't work. Somebody from the audience asked if it was it said that he liked it at first, but it was kind of getting to the point where it felt like they were running a checklist at this point. And that kind of then bled into a conversation about the artwork in Rat Queens and how things had changed, how the original artist had, he had been accused, I don't know if he's been tried or convicted, but he'd been accused of domestic violence, I believe is what it was. And this is a comic book which is all about female characters. And there was some discussion of how that impacts, the fans, how the fans are going to deal with that, how they're going to interpret that. Having somebody who had committed domestic violence, and I'm not sure he's been convicted of it, but had been accused at the very least of committing domestic violence, and is now drawing a comic book which is has been drawing a comic book which is very pro-feminist, I guess. But so I'm not sure. There was a little bit of talk about Captain America, The Truth, which was that great series, which I read back in about 12, 13 years ago. I think it came out in 2003, I think, which was that series by, oh boy, let's see, I'm going to have to look this up. Kyle, let's see, here it is. The series by Robert Morales and Kyle Baker, yes, which dealt with the origins of Captain America, and they retold the story in which the Captain America, the super soldier serum the U.S. government, the U.S. Army had experimented on black soldiers with the super soldier serum before they gave it to Steve Rogers. And what happened was, this is a 7-issue miniseries, and this led into some things that from Young Avengers. But this took place during World War II, and the original Captain America was an African American man who was was the only one who had survived the experiments. The others who had been injected with the super serum there'd been adverse effects. Presumably they were still working, they were still refining the super serum, the super soldier serum. And it had adverse effects, and I have not read it since it first came out. But it was an excellent series. I love the art, I love the look of the book, and I love the fact that they take a story and they mix in things, actual historical things, which you would not normally see in comic books at that time. And on top of that, let's see, where was I going with this? They take actual events. And I've lost my train of thought. Beautiful. But they did. They took actual events, and they mixed it with a very interesting art style, very different art style. And I thought it really worked well, and it was great. It was a great story. I know that there was a lot of pushback. Once again, a lot of fanboy rage over that at the time. But I think that was an excellent story that came out of Marvel. And I believe that was from the Bill Jemas era of Marvel, when he was still the publisher or the editor-in-chief. I'm not sure which it was his time. I think he was the publisher, because I think Joe Quesada was the editor-in-chief at that point. And the one thing that came out of this panel is that even though people want diversity in comics, you still have to write good comics. And even though they didn't say this, I think it's implied the art needs to be good as well. You need to be able to tell you need to have good stories to tell, and you need to tell them well. It's not just about adding diversity to comics. It's about doing it in an excellent way. And I guess there was one other thing that came up, which was that it's not, you're not going to, and I don't know, I may be paraphrasing a bit here, but there was some question of how do you do this and when do you do this, whether you kind of do it slowly or do you need to do it all at once. And I think these things are going to happen organically in some ways, but I think you have to start somewhere, and you can't wait for the perfect comic book writer to get this started. You have to, because you're going to make, no matter what you're doing, there's going to be mistakes. There's going to be misfires. Not everything's going to be great. And on top of that, there are going to be some things that are going to come out that are going to be great that you're never going to have foreseen that they would be great because you wouldn't have given them a chance otherwise. And that's why there's a need for more inclusion in comic books, both the artists, the writers, the editors, as well as in other media like television and movies. So this was a great panel. It was much more interactive than the other panels. There was a lot of back and forth between members of the audience and the panelists. I hope that the questions from the audience come out. Unfortunately, I think both on all three of these panels, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to hear the questions from the audience. So it's possible that so hopefully whoever's talking and responding to these questions, whether it was the diversity panel or Howard Chaykin or Steve Englehart, hopefully all of them say enough to give you the context of what the question was. Because I did not write down the questions. Well, I wrote down some questions, but I'm not going to try and insert all these, my recording of what the question was. I'm just going to throw the audio out there when I've got it. So that was it basically for the Comic-Con for me. It was 4 o'clock when this panel ended. I had gone up to the panel room at 12:15. The show ended at 5 o'clock. I thought about going back down to the showroom floor, but I didn't know what I was going to do other than wander around and possibly buy more comic books. I had already bought 50 comic books, which is plenty. It's probably as much as I've ever bought at a convention. I didn't feel the need to buy any more, so I left the show. I walked back to my car. On the way back to my car, about 2 blocks from where my car was parked, there was a huge but there was a big traffic accident which was blocking a lot of traffic on Light Street between Lombard and Pratt, if you know Baltimore. There was a car that had flipped over that was upside down. There was all kinds of police cars there. I believe there was an ambulance or two there. They had all kinds of traffic blocked off. When I got within a half block of the garage, traffic was just nuts. And while my original plan had been to get my car and drive home, I decided I should get something to eat. There was a Subway right there on the corner, but then I remembered there was an Afghan place around the corner on the other side of the block. So I walked around there. I wasn't sure if it was open. It was. It has a very similar name to a place I went to last year. This one is called Maiwand Kebab. I think it was Maiwand Grill was the place I went to last year, which was several blocks closer to the convention center. The place I went to this time was very small. All of the tables were taken, so I got takeout. I had chicken kebab with salad and rice and bread and some hot sauce of some kind. I took it up to my car. I ate in the car. And then I finally left. it was about 5 o'clock when I left, 5:05 when I finally left. It took probably 10, 15 minutes to get my food, 10, 15 minutes to walk back to the car, and I don't know, I spent 20 minutes or more eating and getting my stuff organized, and so it was just after 5 when I left. Like Saturday night, it took me about 20 minutes to get to the highway because of the traffic. The car that had flipped over was still flipped over when I drove past it. They didn't have traffic blocked off quite as much. I think they must have cleared the people out of there, but they still, and I think there was a tow truck there trying to, I guess they probably got to flip the car over before they could load it onto a flatbed. I don't know. But I managed to make that, because I had to turn onto Light Street to get to, that was the route I was trying to take, turning onto Light Street to get onto 95, and then turn on to Conway or something like that. It took me about 20 minutes to get on the highway. There was an Orioles game that day, so there was a lot of foot traffic from the Orioles game. Must have just let out, and or it was ending, or it had ended, because it wasn't too crazy, the foot traffic, but there was a lot of people crossing the street when they didn't have the light and holding up traffic. So it probably would have been a little faster if it hadn't been for that. So I got home around 6:05. Once I got on the highway, no problems driving home. And I mean, looking back, I think that 2 days was plenty for this event. It was, I really loved the panels today. You know, honestly, if I had to rate them, or for the second day, or the Sunday, I think on the whole I enjoyed the Sunday panels more than I did the Saturday panels. The only panel that I really loved from Saturday was the writers panel. The other two panels were good, but the three panels on Sunday were all good. I was completely into them. I loved the questions. I did not ask any questions. I had a couple questions in mind during the Steve Englehart panel, but I did not ask them. There was, while 2 days was enough for me for this convention, I wouldn't have minded being able to go. There was a couple panels on Friday, in particular one on the pulp roots of comic books that I wanted to go to on Friday, but unfortunately I had to work, so I couldn't. If it wasn't for that, I would have been fine not going to the show on Friday. And one last thing. When I was digging through some back issue bins, I think this was on Saturday, I overheard a couple guys talking about Ghost Rider, and they were talking about, what was it? How his look has changed, and one guy was saying, he's got a pumpkin head now, and I have no idea if this is now or if this is at one point in the past. And his reaction to that was, "What's next? A paper bag?" And I just thought that was so funny that he would go to that, because of course Ghost Rider, his head's on fire all the time, so it'd be a flaming paper bag or what? But yeah, I mean, I had fun. I don't know if I had quite as much fun as I did last year. I kind of feel like I've lost a little bit of the... I didn't spend much time in Artist Alley. I didn't get any artwork. I brought a plastic sleeve with me to bring art home, but I just didn't find anything that I really wanted. And but it was fun. I bought a lot of reference books. I think about 20 reference comics for my collection of reference comics, and plus a bunch of other things that I want to read. Some of them I finished off runs like of Alpha Flight. In other case, I filled in comics on runs like Teen Titans and Flash and Young Heroes in Love. But it was a lot of fun. I think I still prefer Heroes Con to Baltimore, although Baltimore is definitely a cheaper ticket for me because I don't have to pay for a hotel room. And I think I paid less than, I think when I added it up, it's less than $200 I spent at Baltimore this year. And that includes parking, that includes food, that includes my ticket to get into the show, which was something like $65 or $70. That includes all the comic books I bought, and I think I got 50 comic books for $39 or something like that. So it was a lot of fun. I'm sure I will be going next year unless some scheduling, something happens that causes me not to be able to go. But it's a great show, and if you have the opportunity, you should definitely check it out in the future. A few more words before I wrap up this episode. I didn't buy a t-shirt this year. Last year was actually the first year that I bought a t-shirt at Baltimore Comic-Con, and I mean specifically a convention t-shirt, as in the t-shirt which has the Baltimore Comic-Con logo on it. I thought last year they had a really cool t-shirt. It was drawn by Francesco Francavilla, and it was a picture of the Spirit, and it also had a statue of Edgar Allan Poe. And I thought it was a really neat design last year, and that's why I picked it up. This year, it was a drawing by Frank Cho for a comic book called Skyborn, and it really didn't impress me. The other interesting thing about that is that last year's, the image that was on the t-shirt was also the image that was on the cover to the program guide, but this year it was a drawing by the convention guest, Kevin Eastman, who was one of the creators of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a comic book that I never really got into, or the TV show. And that's what was on the cover to the program guide, but for whatever reason they decided not to use that for the t-shirt. I'm maybe there was a timing issue, or maybe they didn't like the idea of using that, or maybe they had problems getting it licensed. It would have cost them too much. I'm not sure what it is, but I might have bought the T-shirt if it had been that, even though I'm not a Ninja Turtles person. I think I do have a couple comic books, but I think they're ones I inherited from my brother. But it's anyhow. So I didn't buy a T-shirt this year. Saved me $20 or $25, whatever it cost me last year. I didn't get any unexpected discounts on Sunday like I did on Saturday. Everybody charged me exactly what I thought they would charge me. And the other thing I wanted to mention, or one thing that I wanted to mention about the Howard Chaykin panel, the spotlight on Howard Chaykin, was that at the end of the panel, after I'd stopped recording, he stood up and he said, "Wait!" And then he got everybody to stop, and then he sang this song, and I did manage to get my recording again before he started singing. So I did get a recording of it, but what's missing is the part where he says, "Wait!" So I will include that at the end of the panel when I post that. And then finally, I wanted to say something about Steve Englehart. Just give a little bit of background information on Steve Englehart, because I don't think I gave very much during when I was talking about the spotlight on Steve Englehart. His first work at Marvel was in January of 1972 on an issue of Sergeant Fury, number 94. It was later that year that he started his run on Captain America, which ran from issue 153 to issue 186. And as I mentioned before, that was where Cap becomes Nomad for the first time, and the Falcon gets his wings. And I believe there's some other things that happen in there. And some of those, I want to at least read some of that run for both of those things. He also had runs on for DC. He had a run on Green Lantern from issue 188 to 205. And then at that point it became Green Lantern Corps for issue 206 to 224, which he also wrote. And I think there was one more issue in Green Lantern Corps, but he didn't write it for some reason. And I've never been a big Green Lantern fan, so I have like one or two issues. Well, I've got more than one or two issues. I've got a few issues of Green Lantern, but so I've never read. I don't think I've read any of that run of Green Lantern. I'm kind of curious about it, but it's just not at or near the top of my list. I mentioned that he did the story where the Manhunters were brought in, and which first tied the Manhunters to the Guardians of the Universe, the Guardians who live on the planet Oa, the blue-skinned guys. That story ran in Justice League of America 140 and 141. I looked into this. I really would like to read that story, but there are no reprints. The story has never been reprinted, and it's not available on Comixology. This is the story that inspired the second story in the first season of the Justice League cartoon. So the first story after the introductory story, which I think was called Secret Origin or something like that, which introduced how the Justice League was formed, at least in that version of the Justice League. And so that was the second story, was the one, and it was called In Blackest Night, and it's the one where Jon Stewart is arrested and put on trial for destroying a planet. Now, as I understand it, I haven't read the story from Justice League of America 140 and 141. It's basically the same story with the exception that it isn't Jon Stewart, it's Hal Jordan. Well, it probably isn't exactly the same story, but I think the basic elements of the story are the same, that Hal Jordan gets arrested for doing something. Maybe it's destroying a planet, I'm not sure. The Manhunters are involved, and before it's all over, the Justice League has to do battle with the Manhunters because the Manhunters are up to something evil. I haven't watched this story in quite a while, but as I recall, it's a pretty good one, and I probably should go back and watch it again, but I really would like to get those comic books when I looked on mycomicshop.com for those 2 issues of Justice League, and his run, Steve Englehart's run on Justice League of America, only lasted about, I think, a year. It may not have even been that long. It may have been something like 9 months. And actually, both of those issues are kind of giant-sized issues. That's when they were doing the double-sized issues or more. So it's more than really 2 traditional comic books, where they probably would have been spread across like 4 issues or maybe even 5 if the issues had been regular length at that point. But that was at the time that I think those were 60-page giants or something like that. I think they were something like that, 60-page giants. I mean, you can look it up on comicbookdb or comics.org, or even on mycomicshop.com. And when I looked there, they had both issues available in very fine for, I believe, $10 a piece. And I found a few copies for a little less than that elsewhere, but it's not going to be. I'm not going to be able to find this, I don't think, in a dollar bin. I'm going to have to pay at least a few dollars a piece for those comics. And I toyed with the idea of ordering those issues, and at the moment I've decided to hold off. But I really would like to read that story, the comic book version, the original version of that story, before I go back and rewatch the cartoon version from the first season of Justice League. About Steve Englehart, most of his work. What I want to say is that the fair amount of work at companies, he did a fair amount of work at companies other than DC and Marvel, but there's nothing that I noticed that was really noteworthy or that really stands out. I think most of his best-known work is at DC and Marvel. I don't think there's any critical successes. Or maybe I shouldn't say success. Any critical darlings, maybe? Things that are well regarded by comic book fans that he did elsewhere. And most of his DC and Marvel work was in the 70s and 80s. His last, probably most significant thing was he teamed up again with Terry Austin and Marshall Rogers to do a follow-up. Well, I don't know if it's a follow-up or if it's, because I haven't read this, or if it's just another Batman story called Batman Dark Detective, and that came out in 2005. I believe there is a trade paperback of that. I'm not sure, and it probably is available on Comixology, but I didn't check there. But that's his last, most recent thing that Steve Englehart wrote, probably of any significance for either DC or Marvel. He may have done a little bit of work since then, but that's the last thing that really stood out when I looked through his body of work on the comic book DB. That's it for episode 123. My coverage of Baltimore Comic-Con 2016 will continue sometime down the road when I post my recordings of the panels I talked about on this episode and the previous one. Dave Talks Comics can be found at davetalkscomics.com, as well as on iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other locations. If you have comments or questions, I can be reached at davetalkscomics@gmail.com, on Twitter at Dave Talks Comics, or leave a comment on my website. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.